In this lesson, we're going to talk about the seedless plants. And let's look again at our three major categories. And this is how all plants are divided. They are divided not into phyla, although some books will still call them phyla, and many books will call them divisions. And there's non-vascular plants, vascular that has seeds, and vascular that does not have seeds. We're going to look at the non-vascular and the vascular without seeds in this particular lesson. So we're going to look at 2 out of the 3 plant divisions, but the biggest division is the third one, which is lesson 3. So non-vascular plants are in the division called Bryophyta, and you need to know that, and you need to know the 3 examples. So Division Bryophyta are the non-vascular plants: moss, liverwort, and hornwort. Now remember, what is the primary vascular tissue? Xylem and phloem. So these are non-vascular plants, meaning they do not have xylem and phloem. Well, what does that mean in a plant? What is the xylem and phloem? What does vascular tissue do in a plant? What does our vascular system do in us? Well, it transports material because we are a multicellular organism and we have so many cells that we have to have a system where nutrients, oxygen, waste, and so forth can be transported from one part of our body to another. And that's going to be true in many of the plants, but not in the phylum Bryophyta. And so because of that, they're not going to be very tall. If they were big and tall, they would need a vascular system to reach all of the cells. So these plants are called bryophytes from the phylum or from the division called Bryophyta. And it's interesting how, again, they pick these words because of the meaning and the characteristics. And Bryophyta means moss-like plant. And of course, there's various mosses and other plants that are like it in this category. Now, because they do not have vascular tissue, they do have to have water, they do have to have materials, they need to get oxygen, they carry out photosynthesis, they need carbon dioxide, and they need nutrients, and they need to get rid of their waste. So how are they going to do that if they do not have vascular tissue? Well, they're short, they're small, and so they're thin, and therefore that can take place. If it's water, it's going to take place by diffusion. By osmosis, which is diffusion. And if it's other materials, we just call it diffusion. So all of it can be referred to as diffusion. Sometimes the moss is going to have parts that look like roots, they look like stems, they look like leaves, but there is no vascular tissue, so they don't have roots, stems, and leaves, which means that a true root has vascular tissue inside of it. A true stem has vascular, has xylem and phloem in it, and a true leaf is going to have xylem and phloem. They're going to live near water. They're going to live in shady places where it's not too sunny, just where you went, hopefully, and found your moss for your moss terrarium. Now, just because a plant has the word moss in its name, it is not always moss. And I'm not sure why they gave it the name, but it's not moss, so it does not belong in the division Bryophyta. 3 examples. Irish moss is an algae. Reindeer moss is lichen and a fungus. Lichen, which is a fungus and an algae. And then Spanish moss, which probably most of you are familiar with if you've ever been down in Savannah and those areas. It's a flowering plant, so it belongs with the vascular that produces seeds. So here's what they look like. Irish moss. Reindeer moss. If you go out in the woods, you should be able to find reindeer moss very easily. And then down in the southern division, the coastal, you would see the Spanish moss. Not moss. Now you need to know what are the parts of a moss plant. If they don't have roots, stems, and leaves, then what do we call these parts? Well, they have a leafy shoot, The leafy shoot is the part of the moss that is above the ground. So it's the part that you see. It's the part that looks like it has leaves on it. But those technically are called leaflets. So it's a slender stalk with leaf-like structures. Each of the tiny leaf-like structures on the moss, which is called a leaflet, it's only one cell layer in thickness. And that's what in lab, when you did the moss terrarium, that's what you drew, or should have drawn, is one leaflet. It's very thin. Why? So diffusion can take place. The rhizoids are what are below the ground, and what people would refer to as roots, but they're not roots, true roots, because they don't have xylem and phloem in it. And so they are used for anchoring the plant, and they too have to absorb their own water and so forth. So here's the three parts that you need to know of a moss plant. The part above is called the leafy shoot. Each of the leaf-like structures is called a leaflet, and then underground, which are root-looking like structures, but they're not true roots, they're called rhizoids. So that's the three parts of a moss plant. Now the leafy shoot, as I said, is only one cell layer in thickness, and here's a couple of examples of some leafy shoots off of moss. They have a very interesting life cycle along with the fern, and you need to know this slide. It's called alternation of generations because it goes through a generation of asexual reproduction and a sexual phase. Now, most plants either will reproduce asexually or sexually. Not both, but there are some that can produce sexually or asexually. If they do, it's not both of them together on one plant to produce the next generation. Meaning, if they reproduce sexually and get a new plant. If they reproduce asexually, they will produce, by asexual reproduction, a new plant. But moss does not come unless it has a sexual phase and an asexual phase. If it doesn't have both of those phases, you do not get moss. So it's called alternation of generations, the generations being the sexual and asexual phase. The sporophyte generation produces spores. Spores are a type of asexual reproduction. So the sporophyte generation is the asexual phase of the reproductive cycle of a moss. Gametophyte generation, the gametes, remember, are sperm and ova, and they are the sexual phase. So it has to go through a sporophyte and a gametophyte. Now, whenever an organism reproduces by alternation of generations, there's going to be one generation that is predominant. And we'll talk about that in the moss plant. And you don't need to memorize the life cycle of the moss plant, but I want you to see how intricately and how God designed all of this. It's pretty cool. And you don't know all this going on in that little moss that's out in your yard. The top of the male gametophyte bears a little structure at the top, and it's called an antheridium singular, antheridia plural. Now it is inside that structure that sperm is produced. So that's their male reproductive part, the antheridium. On top of the female, though, they have a different structure. It's called the archegonium singular, archegonia plural. And it is what is going to make and contain the ova. So during the gametophyte generation, gametes are made. The antheridium making the sperm, the archegonium making ova. And so the sperm have to get to the archegonium so they can fertilize the ova. And they do that by swimming. And this is one of the reasons why they need a damp environment. They need water, they need rain, they need a damp area so that sperm can swim from the antheridium where it's made to the archegonium where the ova are It will fertilize the ovum. And now, if we're talking about sexual reproduction in animals and in humans, out of that fertilization would be a zygote, and then the zygote would be developing into the embryo, the little baby. But that's not true in moss. Yes, it produces a zygote, but what comes from that zygote is not a little baby embryo. What comes from that zygote is it starts growing this stalk. And at the end of that stalk, it grows a capsule. And the capsule is a structure where the spores are made. So that's called the sporophyte generation, whenever it is growing these stalks with the capsule. Now, why does it need a stalk? The stalk is to produce and make the capsule up higher so that when they're released, the spores can disperse further. So that's why they're on top of a stalk. So when it's mature, it actually blows its lid. The cap comes off, and those spores are going to be dispersed by air, by animals, by insects, and by the water. So when that spore gets in an area, in an environment, which is conducive to what it needs, dampness, all that kind of stuff. Now, what's going to happen out of that spore? Now, remember, a spore has one cell of that organism, but in that one cell is the complete DNA for everything. So out of that spore grows what is called a protonema, a little tiny weird looking structure, which I'll show you on another page. Then from the protonema, that's where the parts that we know of as a moss, the leafy shoots, and the rhizoids will form, which would then be the beginning of the gametophyte generation. And then it starts over again. And if you look on this picture here, you can see the little drawing of a protonema. But above the dotted line, of course, is the stalk with the capsule, producing the spores, which are released when it blows its lid. That's the sporophyte generation. Then the spore, out of it comes a protonema. Out of it then forms the leafy shoots and the rhizoids. And that out of it could develop several plants, as you see, all connected. And then it will grow into either a male or a female moss plant. If it's a male moss plant, it's going to have an antheridium at the top of it. It's a female, it's going to have the archegonium. And that's the life cycle of a moss plant. Now here's some capsules that you can see. If you look to the left, that one has a capsule. Now the capsule came from a fertilized ovum, a zygote. So therefore, that is the top of a female plant. If you look to the right, which does not have the zygote, that is where the antheridium is. So that would be the male plant. Here's some capsules. They're all very different according to the kind of moss that it is. If you look at the one on the right, you can actually see all those little tiny spores being dispersed from that capsule. So it's blown its lid. Now another type of moss-like plant is called a liverwort. The liverwort is Marcantia. You don't need to know its scientific name or anything. It's a common liverwort. It has a Y-shaped thallus, and it has splash platforms. So if you see that little looking umbrella thing on top, that is to direct the water to the right places so that the alternation of generation, so the sperm can swim, and so that the plant can get the water that it needs. So they have these unique little splash platforms. And they also have, remember the liverworts, they're shaped like a liver. You can't see that too much in the plant below, but see where that umbrella is attached to? That would be like the liver lobe. Now there's some benefits to moss, and these you do need to know. One thing is they help to replenish soil. Where does soil come from? Soil comes from rock that are depleted and ground up. And the rhizoids will do that to rock. They also help to prevent soil erosion. Any plant would do that because of its roots or its rhizoids in and anchoring that soil would help to prevent erosion. One of the big benefits and a major, well, what would you call it, where they make money in the United States and other places, is from peat moss, or technically it's sphagnum. And it's used by gardeners. And remember, gardening is the #1 hobby in America. So it's used to pack plants for shipment. And in other countries where it's got a lot of sphagnum but not many trees, they will use it as fuel, also as insulators and that kind of stuff. And it keeps the stuff really well. I mean, there's reports in peat bogs of where humans have been found, like mummified from the peat bog and the peat moss, and have been preserved for over 1,000 years. And other things have as well. And in the past, of course, like if you were MacGyver, if you ever watched MacGyver, he was able to use things in nature to accomplish a lot of tasks when he got stuck in situations. Well, it has been used for surgical dressings because of its absorbent quality, and also it has this antibacterial and fungal resistance to it. So both of those things made it ideal for surgical dressing way back in the past. Now here's again a picture of sphagnum. It comes from the peat moss. It's actually the genus of many different types of mosses, as you can see there. And it's called peat moss because it primarily is found in peat bogs, which is the picture at the bottom. And the picture at the top is showing you some individual plants there, and then of course you can actually buy the peat moss because it's used to add into soil. Why would that be an advantage of adding peat moss to your soil? Well, think about one of its #1 qualities. It's absorbent, so it would hold water longer, and it would be drought resistant. And that's because it actually is made up of living cells and non-living cells. And those non-living cells are the ones that hold the water. Now let's look at our second division. The second division that we're looking at today is Pteridophyta. Pteridophyta. And that's the vascular plants that do not have seeds. So they have xylem and phloem, but they never produce a flower, and they never have seeds. And the typical example that we're going to study is a fern. Ferns are non-flowering vascular plants. They have spore-bearing leaves, which we're going to talk about. They have a different kind of stem. You don't see it above ground, whereas most plants you see the stem and then you see leaves off of it. Their stem is underground, and it's horizontal, so it's growing along the ground under it. And then the leaves are what spring up from that, and so we only see the leaves because that's the only part that is above the soil. So the stem and the roots are actually under the soil. You don't need to know the statistics here, but commonly they get to 1 to 2 feet tall. A very common one is the Boston fern. You see that now all around being sold in stores. I even saw it at a grocery store being sold. Now, tropical ferns, they're amazing because the tropics and the ideal conditions for a fern, they can grow as tall as 60 feet with fronds, and that's the name of their leaves, being 12 to 14 feet. So imagine the tropical ferns. Now, some of the ferns are actually epiphytes, and an epiphyte lives on another plant or on another thing. In this case, it would be a plant, and it would not be a parasite, so it's not living off of that host. It's actually sustaining itself, but it lives on it. So that's an epiphyte, and some of these are. The parts of a fern you need to know: the leaves are called a frond, and the rhizome is that underground stem, and off of the rhizome then are the roots. And another structure that we're going to see on another picture, I think it's the next slide, are the spore-producing structures, and they're called sori, and it's a sporangium. And it's interesting because sporangium means a heap, And inside of them, there's a heap of spores. I mean, thousands of spores. The sori, which is plural of a sorus, will form at different times. Usually it's most ferns, it's going to be in the midsummer, like in July. And it's going to be on the underside of the leaf. And if you didn't know of its life cycle, you would think your plant has a disease. I mean, look at the one on the left, especially. You'd think, oh no, my plant's dying, it's got this disease. But this is natural, this is part of, and the sori are going to be very different depending upon which kind of fern you have. They're all different kinds of shapes, and as you can see, kidney, oblong, linear, curve, star shape, different colors. Those are the sori. And they have an alternation of generation as well. So they have a sporophyte generation, which are the sori, and if you can see the back of that frond, all those light rust-colored dots, those are sori. And that's the fern's life cycle. It usually starts in July on a lot of the ferns. And what come out of the sori then is going to be the spores. They're the spore makers. And from a spore, then what develops is this tiny green heart-shaped structure that's called a prothallus. It's only around like 7 weeks, so you don't see it. It's only one cell layer in thickness, so when you look at that, you would never guess that that's a fern. So that's not its dominant generation. From that prothallus, on it develops the male and female reproductive parts. The antheridia, producing the sperm, the archegonium, producing the ova. Usually they're located near the point and at the notch, but that can vary. This is actually fern sperm. And so the sperm is released from the antheridium to go to the archegonium to fertilize the ova to produce a zygote. And the zygote, when it develops, it sends out the first leaf, which doesn't really look like a fern. But the second leaf is the beginning of the production of the fronds. And they're called fiddleheads. And you can see, look at the shape of them. They look like the end of a fiddle. And that's how the leaves, new leaves of ferns are made. And they're coiled up. Some of them from some of the ferns are actually delicacies in salads in some of your high-end restaurants. And here's again showing you the alternation of generations of the life cycle. And you can see that the prominent generation is the one that produces the spores. So the sporophyte generation is the predominant generation of ferns. Whereas in the moss, the predominant generation was seeing the rhizoids and the leafy shoots and the, now I've lost my thought, but the thing above the ground. And so that is the predominant generation. So that is the gametophyte generation. So make sure you know for the quiz that the predominant generation for moss is the gametophyte generation, and the predominant generation for a fern is the sporophyte generation. Ferns usually require 3 to 7 years to reach reproductive maturity before they go through that life cycle, but as they are maturing, they can grow new fronds all the time, those fiddleheads first. So the dominant generation is the sporophyte, as I said. You don't need to know what a prothallus and prothalli and all that, what they're called. They only live about 3 to 7 weeks. That's why we don't call it a fern. You don't recognize it as a fern. And so it's not the predominant generation. Some other seedless vascular plants are the club moss, the whisk fern, and the horsetail. Club moss is also known as ground pine because how it grows low to the ground and also in temperate regions. And there's an example of what it looks. It's not very high again, but it does have vascular tissue. Horsetail is quite unique, and all of the species except one has become extinct, but the other one that's not extinct is very predominant. And this is when all the leaves are off, and this is what's left. And the epidermis in these stalks, they contain a glass-like substance that's called silica, and you do need to know that. Therefore, that makes its feel very rough. And so back in the colonial times, when you couldn't go to the store and buy a Brillo pad or an SOS pad or something to scrub your pots and pans, they actually went out and picked the horsetail, and they used it to scour their pots and pans before we had made SOS pads and Brillo pads. So that's quite unique. Here's another example showing you it with the actual leaves on it. So horsetails have small leaves that grow in circles around the stem. And horsetail stems are hollow, and they contain tissues which contain the silica. It's a mineral in sand that makes them very abrasive, so they could actually do a pretty good job of scrubbing the pots and pans.